Our reading this morning is from Mark chapter 2, verse 23 through chapter 3, verse 6. One Sabbath he was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need of food? He entered the house of God when Abiathar was high priest and ate the bread of the presence, which it is not lawful for any but the priest to eat. And he gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, 'The Sabbath was made for humankind, and not humankind for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is a Lord, even of the Sabbath.' Again he entered the synagogue, and a man was there who had a withered hand. They watched him to see whether he would cure him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man with the withered hand, 'Come forward.' Then he said to them, 'Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to kill?' But they were silent. He looked around at them with anger. He was grieved at their hardness of heart, and said to the man, 'Stretch out your hand.' He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately conspired with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him." Word of the Lord.
You may be seated. This past Tuesday afternoon, 8,000 Starbucks coffee stores across the country, including our own right up the street here in Ferguson, closed for the afternoon in order to engage in some training and education for its employees. This racial bias training, as it is called, is a result of the unjust arrest of Dante Robinson and Rashawn Nelson in a Philadelphia Starbucks back in April. Now, I shared some of this information with you weeks ago, but I believe that the details bear repeating today because, as the late Paul Harvey was once fond of saying, there is now the rest of the story. In case you have forgotten or had not heard, Nelson and Robinson entered into the Starbucks on the morning of April 12th to meet with a third man, a potential business partner. One of the two gentlemen asked to use the restroom, but he was told by employees that only paying customers were allowed to use the facilities. So then the two sat at a table waiting for the third member of their group to arrive so they could then order and then conduct their business. Within minutes and before their friend could arrive, Nelson and Robinson were being led away by Philadelphia police in handcuffs, charged with suspicion of trespassing. Not trespassing, but the suspicion of trespassing. It seems a store manager was threatened by their presence and decided to call the police, even though Mr. Nelson and Mr. Robinson were only doing what most people do when they go to a Starbucks. Nothing. Their arrest was videoed, it was posted online, and it went viral for millions to have a first-hand look at what happened. And while no charges were eventually filed, can you imagine the embarrassment you would have felt if you had been led away in handcuffs for no reason, and if your arrest was now available for the entire world to see? In a letter shared this week about the need for the store closures and staff training exercises, former CEO and current executive chairman of Starbucks, Howard Schultz, wrote this letter, and I quote, "After investigating what happened on April 12th, we determined that insufficient support and insufficient training and a company policy that defined customers as paying patrons versus anyone who enters into the store, as well as a bias on the part of our employee, led to the decision to call the police. And he continues, for several hours this afternoon, meaning this past Tuesday, Starbucks will close stores and offices to discuss how to make Starbucks a place where all people feel welcome. How to make Starbucks a place where all people can feel welcome. Now, I read this letter on Tuesday morning because a wise friend and colleague of mine down in Chattanooga, Tennessee, shared it. And then my friend Brandon asked this very important question. He said, is there anything the church can learn from this? Now, having already chosen and begun reflecting upon this morning's text before I came into church on Tuesday morning, Brandon's question really stuck with me during my prayer and meditation time in the office. Is there anything the church, and I came up with another part of the question, is there anything the church, but also is there anything the Christian faith can learn in general from this? Think about what Mr. Schwartz said in his letter. First of all, he alluded to what will now be a shift in company policy, but most importantly, in understanding and practice. From this day forward, the term customer at Starbucks is now being redefined. Where it once meant someone who pays for goods and services, from this day forward, the word customer will now refer to anyone who walks through the door of one of their stores for whatever reason. Whether it's to buy coffee, whether it's to buy a triple venti, half-sweet, non-fat caramel macchiato, which is a real Starbucks drink, and it is as pretentious as it sounds. I Googled it and I looked it up. It doesn't matter why they come into the store, even if they come into the store simply to sit, to rest, to wait, to sleep, to do nothing. They are still a customer in the eyes of Starbucks. And two, the company is taking these drastic measures to make certain that every person who enters their doors feels welcome. Welcome to make a purchase. Welcome to sit. Welcome to rest. Welcome to sleep. Welcome to do nothing. Welcome to just be. Welcome to just be without fear of embarrassment or bias or arrest. Now again, the question is there bouncing around and begging to be explored. What can the church, what can the faith learn from this? Specifically, are there customs and practices? Are there words within our church and within our faith practice needing to be redefined, needing to be reshaped, with the ultimate goal of making sure that every person, regardless of why or when they walk through the door, feel welcome and a part of the beloved community God calls us to be and live into every single day, every single week. Deuteronomy 5:12 through 15 says this: keep the Sabbath day and treat it as holy, exactly as the Lord your God has commanded. 6 days you may work, and for 6 days you may do all of your tasks, but the seventh day is the Sabbath to the Lord your God. Don't do any work on it. Not you, not your sons, not your daughters, not your male or your female servants, not your oxen or your oxen, your donkeys, or any of your animals, not even the immigrant who is living among you, so that your male and female servants can rest, just like you. Remember that you were a slave in Egypt, but the Lord your God brought you out of there with a strong hand and an outstretched arm. That's why the Lord your God commands you to keep the Sabbath day. That's Deuteronomy 5. Yet, Deuteronomy 23:25 allows people to pluck grain from a neighbor's field if they do it by hand. If they do it by hand, as long as they're not using a sickle or some other kind of farm instrument. A neighbor in need can pluck enough grain to survive, but can't engage in a major harvesting. For the record, Deuteronomy 23:24, the verse just prior to that, gives you permission also to go into your neighbor's vineyard, pick as many grapes as you want off of their vine, and stuff your mouth and stuff your belly with it. You just can't carry a basket with you or any other kind of container. So feel free. But the question we must consider is this. Were the disciples of Jesus actually engaging in work? In the text that Rebecca just read a few moments ago. Were the disciples of Jesus actually engaging in work? Or were they simply hungry and wanting to feed themselves? Were the disciples of Jesus in violation of Sabbath law and of Sabbath custom? The Pharisees were saying yes. And they were using their strict interpretation of the word work as a means of condemning and trapping and judging and discrediting and perhaps even embarrassing Jesus and his followers. Jesus and his disciples then go from the grain field into the synagogue, still on the Sabbath, where Jesus is greeted by a man with a withered hand. The Pharisees stood back and they waited and they watched because they wanted to see what Jesus was going to do next. Because to heal a man would be an act of work. It would violate the law. And to do so within the walls of the synagogue would be scandalous, would be blasphemous. And in the eyes of the Pharisees, that's just rubbing God's nose in it. The man was unclean, and to touch him would have made Jesus unclean as well. There are all kinds of laws and traditions and expectations and customs on the line in church that day. And so Jesus asks the question, so which is more important? Which is more important, doing good or doing harm on the Sabbath? To save a life or to let someone die? And the Pharisees were silent. They had nothing to say. They knew they couldn't respond as Jesus was redefining what faithfulness meant on the Sabbath. Jesus was redefining what faithfulness to the Sabbath meant. Now, the Pharisees had nothing to say out loud, but in their minds, they were all thinking exactly the same thing. We have never done it this way before. And they're thinking to themselves, our whole life, our whole existence has been around doing things one very clear and specific way. Now, sure, that very clear and specific way put off some people, and it kept some people away. It kept some people from coming. It kept some people from participating. But by goodness, that's not as important as making sure that we do it the same way we have always done it before. Give me that old-time religion. Give me that old-time religion. Give me that old-time religion. It's good enough for me. If it was good enough for Moses, if it was good enough for my great-grandmother, if it was good enough for my grandmother, then surely it's good enough for me. Will Willimon says that the Pharisees are like people who are invited to a party and who, rather than coming to join the party, they stand on the outside criticizing the music that the band is playing. They criticize the shape and the layout in the room and how the chairs are set up, and they criticize the way the chicken tenders are cooked. It's hard to believe that sometimes after 2,000 years, some things never change. On the southeast portico of the Jefferson Memorial, the following words are inscribed. I am not an advocate for frequent changes in laws and in constitutions, but laws and institutions must go hand in hand with the progress of the human mind. As that becomes more developed, more enlightened, and as new discoveries are made, new truths discovered, and manners and opinions change, with the change in circumstances, institutions must advance also to keep pace with the times. Otherwise, we might as well require a man to wear still the coat which fitted him when a boy, as a civilized society to remain ever under the regimen of their barbarous ancestors. The Jefferson Memorial is my favorite of all the monuments in D.C., and that quote is my favorite Jefferson quote. These words by Jefferson are a call to flexibility. They're a call to wisdom. They're a call to discernment, to progress. They're a call to change, and not change for the sake of change, but rather change as a result of reflecting upon and acknowledging the changes that come over time. Circumstances change. Understanding and practices and desires in cultures change. And institutions, whether those institutions are laws, constitutions, the church, or our faith, well, they must advance to keep pace with the times. Sometimes the church and our faith and what we do and how we do it feels like, as Jefferson called it, an ill-fitted coat. That coat that our mothers bought us when we were children just prior to the winter. It was our favorite coat, and it kept us warm and comfortable and cozy and safe. If you tried to put it on now, it just would not fit. And not only would it not fit, you would probably look ridiculous trying to wear it, according to those watching you from a distance. And not only would it not fit, and you might look ridiculous, but if you tried to wear it day after day after day, just out of stubbornness and just out of spite, which, by the way, is a great way to practice your faith and to practice your religion, eventually that ill-fitted coat is just going to tear and fall apart, right? It's just not going to hold up. This week I was down in our basement in our storage room, which is just a hot mess. And I was going through boxes, and in one of the boxes, you know what I found? I found my high school letterman's jacket from 1987 or 88. I don't remember what year I lettered. I weighed 145 pounds then. Can you imagine if I put that thing on? The sleeves would come to here. It would be embarrassing. For me, for you, next week I'm going to wear it. Just so you can see. Sometimes I think the church and the faith as a whole are finally coming to this realization that not everything fits like it used to. If the church is to be a place where all people, who they are, what they think, what they believe, what they hope for and need, it's a place to be where all people are welcomed in the name of the faith and welcomed in the name of Jesus, then we need to be willing to redefine time-honored, tried and true customs and traditions and language. We need to make room for new understandings and practices in order for all people to feel welcome. We have never done it that way before, are the gasping last words of a dying faith in a dying church. And it's not a way to live. It's not a way to be hospitable or welcoming. It's not reflective of the ways of Jesus, who redefined compassion and mercy and love. Jesus, who redefined welcome and acceptance and hospitality and equality and justice. Jesus, who redefined God even, and how God's people live in relationship with God and with one another. I'm going to leave you with this. 100 million people, 100 million people enter into a Starbucks store every single week. 100 million people enter into a Starbucks store every single week. Think about that. Think about that. And know this. The reason why they enter, it's not just for the triple venti, half-sweet, non-fat caramel macchiato.